Newspapers are a dying industry. We've all been hearing that for years now. We've been watching it happen before our eyes, unfolding slowly and steadily with each passing year. I mean, sure, you can still walk into a grocery store and pick up an old school newspaper, but chances are your selection is really limited. You're either buying one of those big time, big name papers, or just some local newsletter that might as well be a package of advertisements. But if you're a certain age, you probably don't care or mind that newspapers are dying. Hell, you might never even held one in your hands, preferring instead to just get your news from TV, the internet, or some other source. And honestly, I don't blame you. That form of news is easy, streamlined, and cheap. It's no longer the wave of the future, it's the present. But there's still one critical element that today's news lacks. And no, it's not some nostalgic yearning for a simpler time. It's actually something that's very pressing, if that's not too fitting a word. To explain, I guess I should provide a little background. Because if anyone's going to believe what I'm about to say, I'll need to establish some credibility. And when it comes to news and newspapers, I like to think I'm in a better position than most. Much of my family's story is built around news and the newspaper industry. After immigrating to this country as a teenager, my grandfather worked as a paperboy to help make ends meet. And when he was 25, he founded a newspaper of his own, the American Gazette. It didn't try to be too local or too national, but it became popular in its own right, mostly because it reported stories that others wouldn't. There were stories considered too small for the national media, but too large for the local media. But it reported news that still mattered, and reported it thoroughly, accurately, and ethically. My grandfather even had this motto plastered on every wall in the office: "Tell the news that matters to the people." Now, I know that sounds like a cheesy platitude, but I promise he really took it seriously. And he got everyone who worked for him to take it seriously too, including my father. Eventually, my grandfather retired, and my father took over. And he was the one who actually helped the Gazette grow to a highly respectable outlet. Under my father's guidance, we had millions of subscribers and a reputation that most papers envied. So much so that other media outlets referenced us whenever they needed some extra credibility. But then, the internet happened and, well, I'd rather not get into how that undermined every newspaper in existence. All you really need to know is that that was the main factor in the American Gazette's decline. And while it didn't decline as rapidly as most papers, don't deny that we certainly felt it. And it took a hell of a toll on my father, as well as my entire family. Me being the youngest of 4 kids, I grew up watching my dad struggle to keep the Gazette relevant. Year after year, he had to keep fighting to maintain the paper's relevance, as well as their standards. But even at a young age, I knew that was a losing battle. I suspected everyone knew on some levels. It was why my father started drinking so heavily. It's also why things became increasingly strained between him and my mother. They ended up divorcing when I was 10, and my mom will always make the case that it was the right thing to do for our family. But she had to know on some levels that it made things so much worse on my father. But however bad that divorce might have been for the family, it really didn't change the end result. Ultimately, the American Gazette was going under. I knew it, my father knew it, anyone with an internet connection knew it. We all watched as the Gazette's best reporters left for other gigs. Some moved to other legitimate news outlets, but most of them ended up working for these bullshit clickbait sites disguised as news sources. You know the ones I'm talking about. I won't name names. I'll just say that my dad rarely mentioned them without long strings of profanity for a good long while. But it's what happened during those last couple years of the Gazette that's most relevant to this story. And, depending on your perspective, it might be the most important news story to ever come out of the American Gazette. You see, during the same time, my father's health was in serious decline. Between his heavy drinking, his divorce with my mother, and the constant stress of watching our family legacy just die, he was not in a good place. Now, I still tried to be there for him. I'd recently graduated high school and was going to community college, so I helped out at the paper whenever I could, knowing full well that my siblings and mother weren't going to do squat for him. But even though the end of the American Gazette was near, my father kept working, putting out a new edition on time even as people quit or got laid off. I admired his dedication, even if it was futile. I even tried to encourage him. I honestly don't know how much good that did him. I might have been the only one who made him smile during those times. I wanted to help him make plans for when the Gazette finally ended. Bad health aside, my dad still needed a job. He definitely had skills and qualifications that he could market. But every time I tried to sit down with him, he refused to talk about it. He'd either change the subject or storm off angrily, usually in search of the nearest liquor bottle. I admit it was frustrating. I just couldn't understand why my father refused to accept the inevitable. But therein lies the problem. I didn't understand because I didn't know all the facts. And, well, I ended up learning those facts by accident. On this cold, stormy Sunday night, my father gets this strange visitor. Now, I wasn't supposed to be there that night. I told my dad that I had to stay with a classmate of mine to work on a project. Now, that wasn't a lie, but we ended up finishing early, and I was worried about my dad being hungover on Monday morning, which had become increasingly regular as of late. I didn't go over with a plan in mind. I just wanted to hang out with him, if only to distract him from drinking too much. And on this particular night, I went in through the back door, something I don't normally do, but did so to avoid the big mud puddle that had always formed around our front door. I came in expecting my dad to be slumped on the couch with a half-empty bottle of whiskey in hand. But instead, I saw him standing at the front door, talking to this strange man I'd never seen before. Just picture the creepiest old man you've ever met. Then put him in an old-school, turn-of-the-century suit, give him a hat and CIA-style sunglasses, and that's how this man looked. And based on the way my dad talked to this guy, they clearly knew each other, but not in a friendly sort of way. It was difficult to make out what they were saying. Remember, it's pouring rain outside. The winds are howling. They clearly didn't know I was there. But what they were talking about, I was definitely not supposed to hear it. I only caught the tail end of the conversation. Most of what my dad said revolved around saving the American Gazette, dealing with mounting debt, and taking care of the staff that we had left. Now, I'd heard that sort of thing before, but this time, he mentioned a few other details. He talked about hiding or destroying the Gazette's printing press, and he talked about dealing with people who knew the extent of their operations. But what stood out for the most part was what he called the final byline. He kept saying that if it were printed, then something big would be lost. Not just the paper, but the power behind it. I thought he was just being vague. Then the mysterious man spoke, and even over the loud thunder and wind, and even over the thunder and the wind, I heard his words so clearly.
The power of your printing press is already lost. The story is already written. Once the American Gazette is gone, the masses will be blind to what awaits them. We've done everything we can. All that's left is to publish one more edition, and then brace yourself for what's to come.
It wasn't framed as a threat. It wasn't framed as a warning. It was actually oddly solemn, like a harsh, sobering truth that you do everything to avoid. But eventually, the truth finds you. Truth always finds us, even when it's not reported. That's something my grandfather often said. And in that moment, my father was truly and completely broken. I could see it in his demeanor, the way he sank and sobbed. The old man didn't offer a shred of comfort, but he seemed broken as well. He just shook his head, turned away, and left, disappearing into the storm like a ghost. Even after he was out of sight, my dad just stood there, looking like his soul had left his body, leaving him as little more than a shell of a man. I honestly wish I had spoken up in that moment. I should have gone to him, hugged him, and tried to shake him out of his stupor, but I was just too weirded out by what I'd seen. Those words from the old man just kept ringing in my head. Everything my father said about the final byline and the power behind it, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. Needless to say, I didn't get a second of sleep that night, and not because of the storm. So, at around 3:30 in the morning, I gave up trying. For a while, I contemplated going back to my dad and confronting him about what I'd seen. But instead, I ended up hopping on my bicycle and riding through the pouring rain to the American Gazette's offices. I couldn't tell you what possessed me to do that. Maybe I'm too curious or too stupid for my own good. But I wanted to find the truth. And in the end, I found it, to some extent. And trust me, that little caveat matters. Since my dad owned the paper and I'd helped out there many times before, I had the key to the rear loading area. That's where the freshly printed papers are loaded up on trucks and sent out for distribution. Only a handful of people were allowed back there. My dad usually didn't like me going there, but I did so anyway, knowing this was one of the few times on any given day where no one was there. I went into the building, feeling very nervous but very restless. I just wasn't used to being there when it was so quiet. I also wasn't used to seeing the printing press inactive. It was usually humming along at all hours of the day, printing out copies and whatnot. But now, it was just so eerily silent. Unless you've been working at a newspaper for most of your life, you don't realize or appreciate how hard that hits you. For a while, I just found myself running my hands along the machinery, not sure of what I was looking for or what I was doing there. My dad said these machines had real power. I thought he meant that in the sense that they printed news. They helped disseminate the truth. And yes, that is accurate, but only to an extent. And I only realized that when I actually found something I wasn't supposed to find. It was in one of the large storage rooms, the one where we keep the industrial rolls of paper. Now, I'd been in there before. It was never anything special. And I only went in because these big unmarked boxes were blocking it, but unlike every time before, there were no big rolls of paper. No spare equipment, tools, or ink containers. They were just more stacks of boxes. Big, white, unmarked boxes with these special tops with locks on them. Most were already secure, but a bunch were still open and scattered about, hinting that someone left this room in a hurry. Most likely someone else who wasn't supposed to be there. So, using the light on my phone, I found the nearest open box and looked inside. What I saw, I'm still struggling to process. But I swear, what I held in my hands that night was very real. There were newspapers, some as old as me, others as recent as last week. And they all had what appeared to be your typical headlines printed on the front page. They mentioned real events and real people. There was just one problem, though. They were reporting completely different outcomes of these events. There was a headline that reported a failed plane hijacking on September 11th, 2001. there was a headline that reported successful assassination attempts of several presidents, including the current one. There were also headlines of hurricanes that never hit land, economic crashes that never happened, court cases that had different verdicts, and scientific breakthroughs that never occurred. I found myself going through every box I could find. I sifted through all sorts of papers like this. It was like reading news from a different timeline or something. I honestly thought it was some kind of joke or prank. Anyone who hadn't grown up in a newspaper office probably would have written it off. But I knew the American Gazette's style and structure. I knew the unique tone and standards of the paper that my grandfather founded. It all looked so real. These weren't some draft headlines or something prepared by reporters just waiting for the results to come in. These things had pictures, interviews, real tangible details that you couldn't easily fake or make up. Some even referenced local people that I knew. One newspaper mentioned an old neighbor being caught as a serial killer, which was impossible because that neighbor died in a car accident a year before the print date. Another mentioned a high school friend of mine who went missing as a child. But I know that didn't happen because the guy had perfect attendance all throughout college. It was so confusing and disturbing. Had I stopped there, I might have just left feeling weirded out, figuring that maybe this really was some elaborate prank, something the tech guys did before everything closed down. But then, I found one last box in the corner, one that had these odd red stains on it that I now assume was blood. Inside, there were more papers, but they covered future dates. And a lot of the headlines were disturbing, to say the least. More than one paper reported major wars starting in Europe, Africa, South America, and South Asia. A few others reported the emergence of a new pandemic, one much worse than what we just experienced with COVID-19. But the last one I saw, the one that prompted me to share this story, it was definitely the worst. It had no pictures or photos on it. It was all text, no ads, very little white space, and no filler. It also had the exact date for when the American Gazette was set to close completely. And that's just a few years from now, mind you. As for what it said, well, before I read it, know that I'm already preparing to skip town. I dropped out of community college yesterday, I left a note for my dad this morning, and where I'm going, I prefer not to say. Instead, I'll just leave everyone with the final story from the final issue of the American Gazette.
The end has come. Truth is no more. Humanity is doomed. This morning, as of the publication of this paper, the end is set to descend. For years, decades, and centuries, humanity has required news. That news, however biased it might have been, had to contain a seed of truth. But that is no longer the case. With the end of this publication, news is no longer news. And without news, there can be no truth. Without truth, humanity cannot continue. When the sun sets tonight, the last vestige of truth will vanish. The skies will become dark. The ground will grow cold. Fire will no longer be hot. The concept of life and death, real and unreal, knowledge and ignorance, it will no longer have any meaning. Without such distinctions, humanity cannot exist. Reality cannot exist. When the end comes, it will not be a war, a cataclysm, or even an act of God that ushers it in. It'll just be humanity failing to grasp the truth. But this time, the truth won't set us free. It'll simply destroy us. This is the final story of the American Gazette. This is the last story of the last newspaper that understands and grasps truth. As such, this is the end.